It's year 6 of Pirkei Avot, and so far we've done 2 chapters out of the 6 chapters.
We've
We've done it very well. So I want to greet everybody who is here and those who are watching online. Hello, and hope that this maiden voyage of our broadcasting our classes live and archiving them to Ustream works out. So many of you have been studying Pirkei Avot with me for several years, and some of you this might be the first time studying this text. So we're going to take a little bit of time now in the beginning of what is usually about a 35 or 40 minute class, sometimes a little bit longer, to, in the beginning of this class, talk a little bit about what Pirkei Avot is. And it is probably, next to the Bible, the single most studied piece of Jewish literature. And that's for a number of reasons. The content has a lot to do with it, the timeless teaching, but also because conveniently there are 6 chapters of it, which one each is read in the 6 Shabbases between Passover and Shavuot at Shabbos Mincha. And because it is read traditionally between Pesach and Shavuos at the Shabbos afternoon Mincha service, it's included in most standard Sidurim. So it's really the only work of Talmud that also appears in the prayer book and has been that way for centuries, which helps to build its popularity. Pirkei Avot, it literally means the chapters. A parak is a chapter, Pirkei, several, of the Avot. So the question is, what does Avot mean? And the standard answer is the fathers. So which fathers are we talking about?
Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Right, so Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is usually what we think about the fathers, except that this is much later historically. If Abraham lived somewhere around 2000 before the Common Era, Pirkei Avot is really from about 100 of the Common Era, or maybe 100 years before that. But the Avot, the fathers that it's referring to, are probably the rabbis, probably the elders of that time. And it's an interesting title because not only does it mean really the elders, but the fact that it's called Ethics of the Fathers, I kind of read the same way that I read Sons of Israel, the title Sons of Israel. It's so ironic, or not ironic, but it's funny that in Hebrew, the synagogue is called Bnei Israel, which means children of Israel. But in English, it's called Sons of Israel. Of course, the difference between children and sons is right, half the population. Right. And the same thing is true that Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, might mean something akin to ethics of parents. But this is moral education that parents should share with their children. And as we study more of it, you'll see that these are kind of lessons that if you can impart them to your kids and to your grandchildren, they'll probably be better off for it. And so that's another definition. There is yet a third definition that I want to share, and that is that Avot also could mean, it is a technical term meaning categories. So it's categories of learning, of a particular kind of learning. Avot is the 39th out of the 63 tractates of the Talmud. Okay, so what is the Talmud? The Talmud is the quintessential code of Jewish law. It was written between 200 and 500 of the Common Era. The basis, the nucleus of it, is called the Mishnah, which was edited around the year 200 of the Common Era, you'll remember. And once, of course, the Mishnah was taught, the Mishnah was then subject to wide interpretation. There's a commentary on the Mishnah, which is called, anybody? The Gemara, right? From those, right? The Gemara. And Mishnah plus Gemara equals the Talmud. Right. Very good. Right. So this is actually the 39th of the 63 sections of Mishnah. By the way, not all Mishnah has Gemara. There are 37 of the 63 tractates that are accompanied by Gemara. But the rest of them are just simply statements of the Mishnah. There wasn't a lot of oral discussion after it. So, yeah, so the majority actually is or close to it, right? Is just simply
37 half the Gemara.
37 Mishnahs are accompanied by Gemara out of the 63 tractates. Mishnah itself, and it's kind of interesting to see where, and this will help you to understand a little bit of background of Pirkei Avot. The Mishnah is divided up into 6 orders. Essentially what happened was there was a lot of oral tradition circulating around. Once the Torah was read in public, and by the way, when they read it in public, they didn't read it in Hebrew alone. They read it in Hebrew, and then they had somebody translate it out loud so that the people who heard it would understand what it said. You think you're the first people to sit in shul and hear the Torah reading and go, I don't understand what's being read here? No, 2,000 years ago, the exact same thing was true. They were also reading it with translation. And of course, once it was read in translation, it became subject to interpretation, which is a great thing because now it's accessible and everybody can decide what it means and interact with the text. Good for the Jews, great accessibility. Bad for the Jews, because now everybody's interpreting the Torah. Who's to say what it really means? So you can have the full spectrum of milk and meat means any kind of milk and any kind of meat, as we studied in another class. Or milk and meat can only mean the milk from that particular cow and its offspring. Very narrow definition, very broad definition. And you say, well, who really cares? Well, I really care. If I want to eat at your house, I got to know how you interpret the laws of kashrut. Well, those laws were very subject to broad appeal until they were edited into one particular legal code, which was called the Mishnah. And basically, you'll remember, from those who have studied with me in previous years, the way that the Mishnah was edited. Anybody remember?
Say it again.
The way that the Mishnah was edited, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, sent emissaries into all of the great learning academies as far as he could, as far as his reach would extend. They brought back all the opinions. They categorized them. Said, okay, all the laws of kashrut we're going to put on this table over here. All the laws of Pesach we're going to put over here. All the laws of torts we're going to put over here. All the laws regarding women's issues we're going to put over here. And they put all the different opinions categorized. And they had big piles, smaller piles, and smaller piles. The bigger piles were where everybody agreed. Less consensus here. Little consensus, outliers here. And what Yehuda Hanasi did, which was unbelievable on many levels, he took the number 1 pile and he called it the majority opinion. He took the second opinion, he called it the minority opinion, and he threw all the rest in the trash. Good for the Jews, bad for the Jews. Good for the Jews, and now you know what the majority opinion is on any particular issue, and you have a dissenting opinion because Yehuda Hanasi knew he wasn't God. You can't say this is what God meant. You can say this is what most people believe, and this is what the next most people believe. And it's bad for the Jews in that we have no historical record of everything else that was floating around at the time. And we know that there were lots and lots of sects of Judaism at the time, of which we only know now. Pharisees, Essenes, Sadducees, the ones that happen to mostly mentioned in the New Testament is the historical record that we have. But there must have been tons more. But by the time Yehuda Hanasi came around, he was determined to make a much more uniform code of practice to bring Jews to the table at the same time. Yes, Robinson.
It's interesting, since the word Hebrew meant the other, that we were always ones who stood out, and we were the other one.
Right.
And yet, in our decision of which laws to decide, we went with the majority opinion.
Right. We went with consensus. That is true.
Just because we were the minority, and we were, as far as with the other nations,
Yeah, but one could.
But once
yeah.
we get within
yeah,
the Jews,
right. I think that was particularly the reason. When you have a minority, you want that minority to have some sort of core identity. They have to have some basic standardization of practice, or that minority is going to disappear. Well, if you can bring people to the same level, to the same code of practice, at least you're going to have some, and you have some uniformity, you have some staying power.
yeah. I'm just wondering, it would be interesting to know what the ones that were thrown out were. If any of those in that time.
Some of them you
were
actually
relevant
can.
today, and that now today we think that would have been a better opinion.
Yeah. So there are some. If you read Philo lived in that particular period of time, and Philo writes about these different sects and some of their practices, but there's not a uniform code of where. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that chain of tradition in just a moment. So that's what the Mishnah was, his first code of Jewish law. And in these 67 different tractates, it was covered pretty much all of human experience. They were divided up into 6 categories. First category dealt with laws of agriculture, because the Torah is full of all kinds of laws of agriculture and tithing and when you can plant where, what you can plant where, and Shemitah, letting the land lie fallow in the 7th year, all kinds of intricacies in an agrarian society. The second category of Mishnah is called Moed, deals with all the holidays. The Torah's full of holidays and all kinds of rituals associated with that. And you can see that over hundreds of years, some people did Pesach and Seder one way, some people shook a lulav this way. So, there are all kinds of different. And so there's a whole section, including things like Shabbos. I mean, it's huge. So the third section is called Nezikin, and it deals with criminal matters, torts, judges. Because remember, in the Torah, it sets up a whole judicial process. Judges of the thousands and hundreds and the tens, and all kinds of legal issues. If you find something that's wandered off from somebody's property, when do you have to return it? If somebody slips on your property, who's liable? All kinds of legal issues. Then the fourth category is called Nashim. It deals with women's issues, because the Torah has a lot, not only with women's biological issues, but also issues of marriage and divorce and other related issues that might fall under the big, broad heading of women. And then the last two, which are not studied nearly as much, are called Kodashim, which dealt with sacrifices, because it was from the time of the temple, and Tohara, laws of ritual purity. You remember all those laws from Leviticus of, people who get tameh, they have, because of contact with a dead body, or some kinds of ritual impurities. So of those categories, agriculture, women, courts, holiness of temple, purity, which do you think, in which of them do you think Pirkei Avot falls?
That's a good one.
Yeah, it is a good one. So I'll tell you, it deals with the issue of criminal matters, of torts. Yeah, because it's in Nezikin. Yeah, it's in Nezikin. And for several reasons. Number one is that you want your judges and the people who have the authority to be good, righteous, ethical people. Exactly. So that's a big reason there. It's also very much emphasizing the fact that God doesn't want us only to follow the letter of the law, but to be good people. And that the two, there are some very frum people who are not menschlach, and there are some menschlach people who might benefit from knowing a little halacha. So the idea is to fuse the two together, and that's why it is in Nezikin, that God wants the heart as well as the head. And so Pirkei Avot is found in the section Mishnah Nun as Nezikin. We spent a lot of time in previous semesters, years, whatever it was, whatever you want to call our time together, talking about, and this is just important to know in terms of a preamble, what the Rabbis' agenda was who wrote the Talmud. And they had a very clear agenda. It wasn't only to get everybody on the same page, granted majority and minority. It was to make very clear that the rabbis themselves had the authority to be able to say what the Torah really means and the way that the Torah should be put into practice. And you kind of say, okay, that makes sense, but realize what it means. It means that the rabbis were saying they have the authority to be able to say to Jewish people, this is what God wants of us as Jewish people. In other words, I became, the interpreters of what it means not just to live a good life, but to actually connect with the creator of the whole universe. And so what we looked at over our past couple of years in studying the first 2 chapters of Pirkei Avot, of this Mishnah, was the rabbis making in no uncertain terms a link. God gave the Torah to Moses at Sinai. That's the way Pirkei Avot begins in the very first chapters, if you want to go back and read them. They're pretty self-explanatory. And handed it to the men of the Great Assembly. And the men of the Great Assembly handed it off to the rabbis. And we are the direct descendants of Moses at Sinai. At Sinai, God gave 2 Torahs. One is the written Torah that we have in the Ark. The other was all of the oral interpretations that would spin off of that, which we'll spend the rest of human history discovering. Now, the first part is really obvious. You got a paper Torah, you have a parchment Torah. The second part is a little bit of a stretch, hubris, a little bit of holy chutzpah to be able to say. But on the other hand, if you got to try to get back to God on your own, you have no pathway, no way of understanding it, as Robin Sue pointed out before, you're not going to have a people, you're not going to have a community. And remember, Judaism exists on 2 parallels. There's this parallel, which connects us to one another in terms of community, the things that we have in common. And then there's this parallel, which connects us to God. Right. Most Jews, by the way, live on this parallel. Right? We're very good at doing community. We're not necessarily real good about doing spirituality. I was meeting with a couple, Jewish boy who's going to be marrying a non-Jewish girl. Wonderful couple. And I asked to meet with them before because I want them to feel comfortable in the synagogue, and I want them to have Jewish children, and I want them to raise Jewish children here at Bethel. So I wanted to get in on the ground floor of being able to talk to them and make them feel comfortable. So the girl is talking about, the bride is talking about her faith. And that the reason why religion is important to her is that she knew early on that she wanted to have a personal relationship with God. And that her personal relationship with God and her feeling of God in her life is an important part of who she is and leads to her decision making and makes her into a more ethical person. And so I turned to the Jewish guy and I said, he gets the second part of that, but he's not really, probably hasn't too keyed in on the first part. Because we get that ethical thing of being good to each other and being a community and looking out for each other. We do that really well. But in terms of actually connecting with a personal God, Jews are all over the place, and we don't talk about this side very much. We don't assume any uniformity, that people would come to Judaism because it's a statement of their faith. It's much more for many of us, much more a statement of peoplehood. And what Pirkei Avot is trying to do is trying to say that the things that are along this line are informed by this line. That God does have expectations for us as individuals, and collectively as a community we'll understand what those things are. So it was really important to me for this couple to be speaking about the same thing. And I said to the bride, you have a lot to offer this relationship because I think your approach to faith is a very important part of this conversation. And when you raise your Jewish children here at Bethel, I want them to understand what it means to have faith, and you can help them to understand what it means for you to have faith in God, because I want them to have faith in God too. but I want them also to have this whole sense of community, and unless you bring them here, and are part of that ongoing community, they're not going to have that relationship. We'll see how persuasive I was in 5 years, but we'll find out. Yeah,
All right, so she was the non-Jewish
right,
part of the marriage?
right. Yes, she was a
All
non-Jewish
right,
part.
so when they have children, they have to really actually go through a conversion.
Right, which really bugged her. She was like, I understand all of that. She understands that. She just, I don't understand why I can't make Jewish kids. She said to her husband, I understand that there's some reasoning behind this. I don't just entirely get it. We talked about it for a while. But yes, they would have to make... and one of the interesting points that she made, by the way, Helene, was she said, one of the things that I find that's different between me and my fiance is that I chose as a teenager to become a Christian. But he never had to choose anything because he was born into Judaism. To which my response was, yeah, that's part of the problem. Right. Jews need to choose Judaism because the reason why Judaism fades over time is because people don't make a willful choice to say, as an adult, I am choosing Judaism. And I wish a little bit more of what that spiritual choice that you made would be reflected in the Jewish community as well. It made for a very interesting
It's interesting
conversation.
to read that modani every morning, in addition to thanking God for getting your, the 1/60th of you that disappeared during the night.
Do we know it's exactly 160?
Well, that's what they say.
Okay.
I'm going by the
I say.
It's also acknowledging that there is a God, so in a sense you're choosing every day.
Right.
If you, I think the canon brought it up on one of our trips that people should do that.
Yeah, I think that one of the points that, yes, it is true that according to the liturgy, we choose God and God chooses us. What I'm saying is that I think a lot of people, if they have a hard time understanding their personal connection to God, and I think that the lack thereof is an impediment to people feeling like they have a religious connection with Judaism. And one of the things that we've been talking about in the congregation over the past 6 months, fairly extensively, is that one can have a religious identity that is not necessarily hinged on theology. That there are many ways to be a religious Jew. If the definition of religion is that you are religious, is your religion shapes your life, influences the way that you live your life, you are by definition a religious Jew. Some people will, for instance, be ritually involved because it just brings them into contact with lots of other Jews who share a tremendous ethic. It's inspiring, but it doesn't necessarily have to have a theological base to it.
Well, that's why when Al and I chose to have children and we had the same sense of values, religious values, was that we would raise our children with sweetness for the religion, so that when they do leave home and they are questioning themselves as to why they are Jewish and should they stay a practicing Jew,
right?
They have in them all these little molecules of sweetness that we have given them, and they have to realize that that is why they are who they are.
Right, but absolutely, and that's all wonderful when you give them all of this positive approach to Jewish practice. But it particularly puts a point on what I'm saying, which is there was no theological imperative in that entire equation. There was no saying, you're doing these things because this is what God expects of you, my little kinder, to do that. It's a very different kind of approach. And I think that when people think of religious, they think of either one of two things. They think of religiously observant, meaning keeping kosher and davening 3 times a day and all of that, or they think of having a spiritual connection with a supernatural God that they feel in some kind of a personal relationship. And I think that what I have learned here is that there's tons of more expression of Jewish religiosity than either of those two things. That people who are involved in tzedakah work because they're doing it as a Jew, because they believe that the Jewish tradition motivates them to be involved in Jewish and family and children's services and to take care of the poor and the disadvantaged, can do that without necessarily having a theological imperative and feel good about it as a way to answer, yes, I am a religious person, even if they don't necessarily daven 3 times a day, keep kosher, come to shul on a regular basis. There's a lot more ways to be religious than opening up a prayer book and sitting quietly or singing along on a Shabbos morning. And when we look at the Pew study and they ask, are you a religious Jew? Everyone, it's so easy to be able to look at another person who's frommer than you and to say, no, I'm not religious.
Which is
As opposed to take personal ownership and to be able to define religious as someone whose religion informs their lives. By the way, there's a lot of Jewish people who are not religious at all by that definition, whose Judaism does not inform their lives, does not motivate them to behave in a particular way because they're part of the Jewish people. But there are many, many people, including the majority of our synagogue, who I suspect are motivated to do things above and beyond what a normal civil American would do because they have a religious conviction. And it's not only tzedakah work, Zionism and reading Jewish books and being members of other Jewish organizations that have all kinds of different goals. All of these things are a religious expression that help us to understand what it means to be a religious person. And it gets back to the concept of Pirkei Avot, because what Pirkei Avot is going to be about is not about halacha. It's not about Jewish law. This is the one section of the Mishnah that doesn't tell you how to do anything ritually. It doesn't tell you how to do Shabbos. It doesn't tell you how to shake a lulav. It doesn't tell you laws of tithing or any of that. It tells you how to treat other people in a menschlich way. It teaches you how to ask yourself ultimate questions. Why am I here? What's life all about? What does the future hold for me? How do I influence the world around me? Those are deep religious questions of which observance can be an expression of a means to the end. But there are lots of ways to get to that end in terms of feeling a connection to the Jewish people, and for many of us, a connection to God. And so that's what makes Pirkei Avot so compelling, is that anybody from anywhere on that spectrum of Jewish life can read it and be motivated to really understand it. Let's take we're going to take a quick gander, and then we're going to get back into it in much greater depth at the first mission in the 3rd chapter, which is on page 16 in your book. We're going to read it quickly here. We're going to just discuss it very briefly, and then we're going to do a very close reading of it at our next session. While we're opening, any questions or comments to the things we were just talking about? Yes, Patty, please.
I was thinking that, when I was thinking about the couple you were talking about, I think one thing that Christians do well is they pray.
Yes.
And I'm not sure that as Jews we do it as well. They pray in the language that they speak. They are brought from when they are very little to just kind of talk to God.
Yeah.
In sort of a talking to God today.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And I think that sometimes it might be easier to build a personal, friendly, warm relationship with God, because when one does that, when one can do that,
right,
and when one feels that it's okay to do that,
right,
which I'm not sure that as Jews we always do a good job teaching our children that's okay, praying that way, and how to do it. If you ever sit at a table, if you ever eat with Christians and they ask you to say grace,
right,
you're the Jew at the table and they ask you to say grace.
They don't mean just motzi.
Yeah, right, exactly. And you're kind of like, oh.
Uh-oh. Right.
So thanks for having us all here, God.
Thank you, Patty, for sharing that insight. I hope it got picked up on the video camera. But you're absolutely right that this realm of kind of personal prayer as the entree to relationship with God is very, very important. And I have two follow-ups on it. Number one is that in writing this ceremony that they're going to be doing at their wedding, and they asked me to review their ceremony for them when I looked it over, one thing that they did is that they pause in the middle of the wedding ceremony, which we don't do in Jewish tradition, of course, and they ask everybody there for a brief moment to silently say a prayer for them in their marriage. It's exactly, I think, very much what you're talking about, that tradition. The second thing is, if you just look on, it's a perfect lead into the Mishnah, and we'll only get about 3 words into it. But if you look at this Mishnah on page 16.
Do you mean page 36?
I mean 36. Thanks, Jerry. My 3 was a little wiped out there. Thanks, Jerry. Yes, page 36, chapter 3. Thanks. 36, right? I was using a Xerox. Thanks, Jerry. Keep me honest. I know I said 30.
You said 16.
I know.
You also said chapter
36.
3.
Right, chapter 3. The Xerox came out late, that's why.
Sure.
If you look at this this Mishnah, we're going to talk a little bit about who Akavia was in the next session. And I will also tell you, by the way, those of you who have been studying with me for a number of years, the first 2 chapters of Pirkei Avot are chronological. And this is not. This is much more random. So the first ones start all the way with Moses at Sinai, and then the second chapter, if you remember from last year and maybe the year before, was the teachings of Yochanan ben Zakkai, really the first rabbi post-destruction of the temple in 70. Now we get into a little bit more random teaching. And I'm going to talk about Akavia, who was right on the cusp of the time when the temple was destroyed, in greater detail next time. But I want to... we're going to read this whole Mishnah, and then I'm only going to focus really on one word before we break. So the Mishnah, I better read it out of the book since the copies turned out light. Akavia ben Michalel used to say, "Reflect on 3 things, and you will not come into the grasp of sin. Know where you came from, know where you are going, and know in whose presence you will have to make an accounting." Which sounds great. Think about these things. You won't come in the grasp of sin. You know where you came from. We are all creations of God. Where you're going, you're destined to do great things, and you're going to be accountable before God, who's going to thank you for all the great stuff you do. But then the Mishnah takes a little bit of a twist. Where do you come from, he asks rhetorically. From a putrid, disgusting drop. Where are you going? To a place of dust, of worms and maggots. Nice. And in whose presence will you have to make an accounting? The most sovereign of sovereigns, the Holy One of blessing, the Kadosh Baruch Hu. A little ominous, I would say. The one word that I want to reflect on here is the word reflect. And in Jewish tradition, what would be a synonym for reflect here? Anybody? What would you substitute if you were putting? Consider. Understand.
Not just look at.
Not just look at. Okay. Contemplate.
Yeah.
Reflect. Contemplate. Think about the Hasidim. Particularly Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, most famously, had a concept called hitbodedut, which means literally being by yourself. And Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav taught his students that they should spend time every day going out into the field and just talking to God. Not with a prayer book, not with an official text. Not only meditating, not only being quiet inside, but taking what you have inside and talking to God and sharing it in the way, Patty, that you were just speaking about with God.
So is that different than the Heshbon HaNefesh that you're supposed to do every day?
Yes, it's very different. And we'll get the Heshbon at the very end of this Mishnah. No, this, yeah,
When I was in rehab,
yeah.
some days I would go out into the garden, and just talk.
Mm-hmm.
Think about what was going on with me and my life around me.
Right, and give voice to what you were feeling.
But just talk to God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And it was really very, very helpful.
right. And I'm glad, and I think that's exactly what it's talking about here, is reflecting. And one of the things when I read this text and I was kind of reflecting on it, you know, finding this quiet time to think about what you're feeling inside and to express it in a personal way to God. Then I look at the world around me, and our world is so afraid of stillness and quiet that in the media-drenched world that we live in, that if you have a quiet moment and you have a cell phone, and now basically most of the world has a smartphone apparently, think about what most people that you see would do in their quiet moment.
They're on their phone.
Exactly. They're doing this on their phone. Exactly. That's what the Rabbi Nachman was giving the antidote to. Reflect is a spiritual pursuit, and it is so anathema to so much of the world that we live in today. By the way, I'm as guilty of it myself. I don't go to my phone quite as often as many of the people I know, but if I get into the car, I immediately turn on the radio. The quiet needs to be filled with some noise. And even if I'm hearing the weather for the 26th time in a half hour, it's cold. You know, there's not much more to say. It's really, really cold. But for some reason, even with the advertisements and all of that, we don't have the opportunity for this heat-voted dude, for this kind of reflection. What this Mishnah is talking about is carving out that quiet time to think about these particular ideas so that you don't fall into the grasp of sin. We're going to talk about this a little bit more extensively. We've talked about it extensively in the past. How you choose to use your time is a deliberate statement of who you are and the person you want to be. And what Pirkei Avot, and particularly the missions that we've been studying, but this one especially, is emphasizing is focused thought is what leads to spiritual growth, which is very much the opposite of what many people think of spiritual growth today, which is, in the Eastern tradition, to meditate away from the world, to realize that this world is not all that important, and to transcend the thoughts, the worries, the concerns, the anxieties of this world. That's not what this is talking about. When you are thinking about what's on your mind and what's on your heart, and you give voice to that, that is not always going to be a peaceful process. It's going to be growth-oriented, it can be cathartic, it can be very, very helpful, but it's not the same. That kind of reflection is not the same as that transcendental meditation where instead of words like, who am I, what do I want to be, what relationships am I working on, where do I need to grow, it's a lot different than Om, Om, Om. Right? The Jewish way is to get in there and to really reflect on what it is. And that's why I think in part this Mishnah, which we're going to discuss in much greater depth next time, talks about stuff that's startling. Where did you come from? From a putrid drought? Where are you going? To a place of maggots. You know, this is. You don't meditate to be with the maggots. That doesn't work that way. You know, this is really kishka stuff. Because to be involved in that process of really self-examination is what spiritual growth from a Jewish standpoint is really all about. So we're going to study Michalel, Akavya ben Michalel, in some greater depth, and we're going to study this Mishnah in much greater depth next time. And I hope it came out on the video for those of you watching at home.